All right, welcome. For those joining on YouTube, this is the Denver Erlang and Elixir meetup for Monday, May 6th. My name is Michael Lubis. I'm hosting tonight. The meetup sponsor tonight is Praxeal.io. So if you're an Elixir developer looking at security or interested in the topic, Praxeal.io is a product that helps you with that, especially if your company is using Elixir in a high secure environment. I'm very excited to introduce the speaker tonight. Toran will be speaking about adventures with synthetic data. I saw him speak in person at ElixirConf last year, I believe. He had some it was really great content on the AI tooling that Elixir has.
Well, I must admit, as we often do, I over-engineered the presentation. And you'll see that. I got very excited about some artwork in the style of Todd McFarlane, if anybody is familiar with that artist. So you probably wouldn't know it today, but when I was a kid, I actually did a lot of comic book art myself, and my favorite artist was actually Todd, kind of more famous from his time in like the Spider-Man series, but I think he actually went on as well to found Image and do Spawn and things like that, which is pretty cool. And one of the things that I can remember back when I was a kid is that, not only did Todd inspire me, but his work and just the inspiration made a huge imprint on basically everything I did. And of course, like I didn't make it big and crank out any comics, but as a result, like almost everything I did had this style of Todd, and especially like the Spider-Man work that he did, which I thought was pretty cool. As I got into tech though, I sort of brought this pattern with me, and I had this similar adaptation of other people's work, you might say. And I always feel bad about that a little bit or feel guilty, but definitely know that it's my hope that when I simplify an idea or share the work of others, that I want to be absolutely clear that they get the credit for this. So in particular, the resources, I'll be sharing like 4 or 5 different resources tonight. But if it's not clear, I'm definitely not an expert. I'm pretty new into the ML space, and I've definitely put in the work. So what you'll see tonight is basically a recap of the last 4 months, where I've just been kind of learning and playing around with synthetic data and fine tunes. And there will be kind of a centerpiece or a focal point on synthetic data, but we'll touch a little bit on fine tuning and alignment as well. As a fun fact, anytime you see this little hugging face icon, that's kind of like an indication that I overwhelmingly support or back this resource, because there are definitely some things that I use that I'll speak about and some things that I don't. And anything that has this fun little icon that shows up in the talk is probably something worth checking out. In fact, it starts right here. It all started back in January. I stumbled across this blog post actually from Edward Donner, I think's his name. And I just suddenly was bit by the bug and just became incredibly interested in just training a language model on my text messages to be able to respond in my likeness. And that's basically the post. And there's like a 4-part series that Edward did that was pretty cool. And so my journey actually through this process, the last 4 months, is really the center of this talk. So if you're not interested in just kind of a storytelling experience or synthetic data about how I trained a chat model on my own chat messages, then probably not going to be super exciting, but hopefully you're here for the right reasons. All right, now one big downside of this talk is it requires a lot more active reading of text than really any other presentation that I've given. So to keep the talk moving and the cognitive load minimal, I've really tried to use almost this same prompt for the entire talk. So we're going to look at this prompt. We're going to be really intentional. And we're going to take a moment here in just a second just to read this. You're probably already reading it. But I want to get familiar with it because it provides like a great example of what I was looking to accomplish with the work that I've done really since January. So in this case, it just says, I'm prompting this model, write a text message from Toran, that's me, to Ross. This is a friend of mine whose name has been, changed to protect the innocent, about making the move to engineering management this year. Keep the message entirely focused on engineering leadership. The message should encourage Ross to embrace this new challenge and capitalize on his unique skill set, which includes extraordinary emotional intelligence, high technical aptitude, and exceptional work ethic. Now this is, you might think this is kind of like a crazy prompt. But what I was really doing was almost like reverse engineering what I wanted out of it. And in the end, I kind of fell back to a prompt that sounded like this. In short, it's like, write me a text message, right? And then here's generally about the subject. So this is kind of a prime example of the type of slide that we're going to be reading. So I do try to keep these about 3.5 sentences. And here's the result. It says, hey, congrats, Ross. I'm thrilled to hear that you've officially accepted the role as engineering manager. Your ability to connect with people on a deep level and your technical acumen make you a natural fit for this type of position. It's exciting times ahead, and I have no doubt your leadership will have a significant impact on the team. So this was one of my personal favorite responses from the model that I had at the end. So this one that I was using sometime in April that I kind of landed on and said, okay, that's the one that I'll give the talk about, and the one I was pretty happy with. So we'll talk about like a holistic evaluation a little bit later, but just in this really quick example, what's important to me and what should stand out to you probably over the next 30, 40 minutes is just this signature language of mine. And the other thing that I liked about this is it's kind of fitting within this window. You know, I'm not one of these people personally that writes a text message that is, 900 plus words long. Usually I'm kind of in like the 300 word limit. So some people go a little bit longer, but for me, this was kind of the end result, the hope that I wanted to get to at the end of this. So, but when I started out, my plan of attack at like the highest level looks something like this. I would build the data set, I would fine tune the model, and then I would serve it with NX. That was basically all I had going into this. But before I started, and this is like not proven, this is like an assumption I had, I just assumed I was going to spend the bulk of my time fine tuning, which should kind of tell you where both my experience and my interest lie. I was very focused before this talk and before January on just fine tune everything. It's all hyperparameters. The data is just what we have. It's an open source data set or it's not, it doesn't matter. But little did I know, of course, that by the end, those numbers would shift a lot. So instead of all this time in fine tuning, which is really my assumption, by the end, I really spent probably 90%, if not more, truly just data engineering. But if I wasn't fine tuning, where would I have spent all this time? And then what did I actually learn from this time in the data engineering world? So this first piece is really just, obviously you're going to spend a lot of time just extracting, cleaning, and then combining data. Next, might surprise some of you, but you spend a lot of time just prompting. And I feel like prompting, maybe in my personal experience, I'll just give my judgment. I very much undervalued a lot of prompting and prompt engineering until this time, the last few months. Also, the importance of an evaluation or an objective. Like, what am I actually trying to do with both the data set work and the fine tuning work? And then finally, what leads us into this talk tonight is just learning how to generate synthetic data. So we'll touch on fine tuning and serving just a little bit later. Those are components of the story, but the vast majority of our time tonight truly will be on the why, the what, and the how of generating synthetic data. So what is it? Hopefully it's obvious, but it's really just artificially generated data that mimics real world data. That's about as crazy as it gets. More importantly though, is probably the question, why? Like, why do you need it? Why would you do it? And the first, which is, probably the reality for some folks is that data privacy is a big deal, or you're in a really heavy compliance situation. And the data that you have, although you have maybe vast amounts of it, just can't be used for some reason. In situations that are like mine, where the real world data is just in short supply, or what you do have just isn't high quality, it's not complete. And that's the scenario that we're going to focus on for my little project specifically. So what else about my data made this side project a great complement to something more real world, something you could do at work? And generally, this is like a little bit of a side rant here just about side projects, but generally side projects are just full of opportunities to learn and grow. So I definitely encourage anyone to build something if you enjoy stretching yourself technically like this. And don't think that this is something you have to knock out in a weekend to be successful. Like I said, I've truly been working on this about the last 4 months. And I still feel like the learning is the great success for me personally. So In my case, though, back to how this is kind of a great fit and how I think actually what I've learned here can be useful in a more general sense, is that in my case, this chatbot was a great fit because the data set that I worked with was very similar in some respects to something you might find at an early stage startup. So the first one here is that the data is proprietary. And the data set that I was working with, this was a lot of very personal information. Stuff that I definitely would not share, probably want shared of mine as well. So one motivation here that lines up really well, maybe with you or maybe what you're planning on doing at work if you have a lot of proprietary data, is I was definitely not going to be going to ChatGPT or really any third party. I was not going to send this data outside of my own home personal network, which is just kind of an interesting constraint, but it was a valuable one because I definitely sense probably not in the position to send off a lot of private data, for example, in my day job. Just we have a lot of data that nobody else has. So we're pretty guarded and protective of that for good reason. The second, which is maybe true again of you and your startup or the data set that you're looking at, mine in this case, I only had about 2 years of text message data. So it was a very small data set, which can be the case elsewhere as well. And then third, the nuance that's in the data set. In my case, really this boiled down to that I found about 3 pockets of people that I respond or write text differently. So obviously like close family, like my son and my wife, I write them a very different style of text message than I send a pure career centered text versus, someone else. So this was just enough though to really have me look at a few different facets of both the data and fine tuning. So hopefully this is both an encouragement on, this lines up well, this project, but also an encouragement to you that side projects can be really closely aligned with what you may do at the day job. So if you don't have one, pick one up. Now, because I lean a little bit more software engineer than I do data scientist, coming up with this term objective function, as you might hear it, or an evaluation really wasn't my strength. But I would, however, ask that you consider this more seriously, especially if you're going to begin a project like this. So for me, on the surface, it was like, how hard can this be? Just prompt it with, write me a text message, and it should spit out the perfect likeness of myself. At least that's what I thought. But the truth is, I hadn't really considered much in preparation in advance of this, what impact coming up with a true evaluation or an objective might have on the work and the way that I work through this weeks or months later. So I definitely encourage you, if you are like, hey, what's an evaluation? You might be like me, you might be here writing code every day. I think more on the data science side, they respect or highly prioritize the objective function. This is new for me, so I'm just kind of sharing it. Now, looking back, because I'm being honest with y'all here, I did not do or practice what I preach here. I did not come up with an evaluation and an objective function. So what you're going to see is me looking back retrospective and just kind of sharing a couple of things that I wish I had asked myself, maybe back in January when I started this. So the first one of those is, how well does the model honestly know my communication style? And this is like point blank. This is me just asking the model. You'll see an example slide later where I just say, what is Toran's communication style? And just evaluating that. Next, what does the model actually know about me? What does it know about my life? And then third, the one that's probably the most obvious in that slide we showed earlier is just, does it borrow the language and the likeness of me from examples that it found in my text messages? Before we start with this data set or any fine tuning or evaluation, we should just know kind of the baseline. And just for people clued in here today, I'm using this Mistral 7B, which is kind of an older language model now. It came out end of summer last year, but it was a really powerful model. And honestly, still today, it does the job. So my plan here was just to understand if I prompt it with the same prompt, so you don't have to read this prompt, same thing, tell me about engineering management, all that. What is going to come out of this? So this is no fine tuning. This is just base model instruct, and it's not bad. I would say the response is decent, but a couple things specific, right? For one, it's pretty generic, which is okay. It's also quite long. Again, I probably don't write text messages like this, so I was hoping that I could steer the language model with the data work that I'm going to do after this. So this is just kind of getting us a heads up. If we end up here when we're done, we've done nothing, right? So let's start by just looking at how we extract the SMS data that I have. And just being honest again, I only had about 2 years of data, which ended up being about 500 conversations. And that's again, just between me and one other person. So imagine every iMessage or whatever thread that you have, if you just squish those down and sort of chunk them by a certain length, I came up with only about 500 conversations, which unfortunately was not a lot. Now, I did find through that post from Edward Donner earlier, the post that he did, a 4-part series, that he used a iMessage tool called iMazing. And I just honestly borrowed the same tool. I figured he blogged about it. I have an iPhone. How bad can it be? It is a paid tool, just to be aware of that. But really all this tool does is say you can check some names and it drops the CSV with all those text messages. It's really nothing crazy. Now I try to take my my coding slides seriously. I don't like to put a lot of code. So what I'm trying to highlight here is really at the top of the screen, which is more what data did I care about? It's really minimal, right? It's like the person's name, which this in case my son Christopher, then it's like direction because that matters a lot. That tells you Christopher wrote me a text or I wrote him a text. And then of course, third is just what is the message itself. So all I'm doing is rolling over this. Probably could do this with less than a stream because it wasn't that much data, but this is pretty basic. Now the piece that I've left, I don't want to say intentionally blank, but to save us all looking at some really bad code here, I've left out the most interesting part or most valuable part, and that is where you're probably going to spend some time both reading and just cleaning all of this text data, right? Now I realize this is the last thing you want to do, especially if you're like me, a software engineer, you're just more interested in writing code or getting to the fine tuning, but trust me, it pains me to say this, but trust me when I say this is actually a really great place to spend your time. And unfortunately, one of the struggles we'll find out a little bit later is just that if you don't spend the time now and you're going to grow from what I consider this to be kind of your golden, baseline data set, the quality problems that are in here, that are in this data, you can imagine, right? As you start to amplify this out, they only get bigger and bigger. So as annoying and uninteresting as this is, I do just thought I would say, please spend the time, clean the data. Now I won't do a whole deep dive on data cleaning. It would be quite boring. You didn't come here for that. But here's a couple of things just to think about. These popped up along the way. They're things I ran into, like hyperlinks end up being a lot of noise, especially if you have very long hyperlinks. They just they take up a lot of space. They don't add anything. Generally, I just found that those weren't super helpful text messages. iMessage does a very annoying thing that you may have seen if you're an Android user and you get all these weird messages. It kind of like takes the original message and says somebody loved it with wraps it in a quote or thumbs up and then reposts it. So you get a lot of duplicate data from all of these weird interactions people do. And so I just had to go through and clean those up or just kind of find some regex type patterns to clean those up. Next, you have all kinds of images like HEIC, the PNG, other stuff that you're just like, you don't want these long GUID values. They're true noise. You got to clean those up. This part's up to you, but assuming you have people talking about salaries and careers and families, you may do some data cleanup. I tried to just anonymize a lot of that or anonymize names especially. And then following this, things like duplicate information will be in there. I don't know. Am I the only one guilty of sending a really well-crafted text message during a holiday like Thanksgiving in the US? And I'm like, oh, that's so good. I'm going to copy paste that to somebody else. I can't be the only one that does that. So anyway, duplicate text as well as some of the stuff I'm going to gloss over for this talk because of time is just grouping these intelligently. And I'm going to show you an example real quick. The outcome of all this data work, so pulling the CSV, cleaning the data, and then producing a set is going to ultimately get us here, which is how are we going to use this training data? And so at the top here inside of our little brackets, we have sort of the instruction to the language model during training, which says just write a chat between Toran and Michael. And Michael says, hey, buddy, it's been a long time. Hope you're doing okay, yada, yada. Toran's like, hey, Elixir's amazing. And then Michael's like, cool, I guess I'll check it out over the weekend. And this is the most clean, visible view of what you're going to end up encoding in your data is really two parts. It's going to be the instruction, that inst code at the top, and then your output. Now, I'm going to show you a less readable, but I want to be concrete. I want to be real with you, just what it looks like. It ends up looking like this. It's just a JSON structure with instruction output pairs. And what you saw in the output, although it was nicely formatted there, is really just condensed down to one big string with conversations up to a certain length. And if you're doing it better than me, up to a certain grouping of I don't want to say knowledge, but some category of conversation. You want to be smart about how you're grouping these because if they're very disjointed, that'll show up later as well. So here I just have in that top one, Michael 1, Michael 2, Toran 3. Imagine 1, 2, 3 are just conversations, right? Keeping it really simple. Okay, now I realize I'm speaking at an Elixir meetup. And I promised to share about serving with NX a little bit later, but to fine tune this model, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, with a tight feedback loop, I did decide to quantize that Mistral 7B instruct, and just to leverage that as quick as I could, because I was mainly doing this on Saturday mornings when I had very little free time. I did find Unsloth was actually a great speed up. Not just because you can quantize, which is great, but just like there's some magic that was early on in the research of the Unsloth team. And not only did it cut VRAM, so you could do this on a 4090 on your own box, but also just really cut time. So I was doing this in under 2 hours for 4 epics. And this is a lot of data. This was like 20 to 25,000 rows. So I don't know what that equates to on H100 money, but since I didn't want to spend any cloud money, I found this actually be really helpful for me. If you want to see all the code that I use to fine tune, it's exactly up here on this Sloth library. And I'll have all these resources available later as well, but not hiding anything. All the code is pretty basic stuff out there. So, all right, so let's talk about evaluation. So imagine now we have this data set, and again, we have our prompt. And what has this data set actually done for us, and how do we evaluate it? So here's the first prompt. It just says, write a text message, same thing. But the prompt is very different than the last prompt we saw from Mistral. This one, of course, is got a few problems. The first one should be very obvious. It's not returning a text message from Toran. It's actually like it wrote its own conversation, which makes sense. That's all we gave it, right? In our fine tuning, we were like, hey, here's full conversations between Toran and somebody else. So that's kind of the only exposure it had to Toran. So I can't fault it entirely. Secondly, though, the response itself, now I'm being really critical, and this is a little bit introspective on my heart, but I was trying to be really encouraging, and just generally I want my messages to be that. And I genuinely don't think this message was super encouraging. I think it says like, I trust you're doing great and you've landed in a good spot. This is after a really dear friend of mine was laid off. Like, I actually don't think this message was hitting it totally. So that's a little background. And then third, there's some language in here, but I feel like it's more generic than truly like Toran specific language. So let's talk a little bit about how did I come up with Toran specific language. Now, one of the things you can do, right, is you can take all your text data, you can chunk it down to the words, and then you can do like statistical stuff with just the words. And I cut out a lot of the nonsense of like a, and, or, the, stuff like that. I was trying to find things that were like me. So what I tried to call these are these signature words from Toran's text messages. And I wanted to use these truly as like a guide on the evaluation. So here's some of them. Like, in my career-centered conversations, I say productive a lot. I say growth. I say impact. Way too many of these words. I guess they're all optimistic. I should feel really good about this, but so let's show you an example again of the one that like I would have been happier with is again the one I showed earlier today, which is like, congrats, Ross. I'm thrilled. I don't know why I use the word thrilled, but I am thrilled a lot. So, but I was actually generally thrilled for this for my buddy who went to engineering management. So. Long story short, this has the language. This is in the correct style. It's a text message, and it's a little bit more encouraging, I think, than the original message. So that's where we end up on the evaluation I want to get here. We're very far from that right now. Now, the second evaluation was me asking, what does the model generally evaluate as my communication style? And so I asked it, just, hey, what are the strengths? And it says, I would say Toran brings a lot of positivity, enthusiasm. When he communicates, he's generally excited about the things and always helpful. He is also a great sense of humor. Oh, wow, I'm just feeling so good right now. Anyway, I won't read all this. I'm getting puffed up here. But the point is, I actually was kind of let down by this. I wanted something more encouraging. Now, it was like upbeat, which I'm like, oh, cool. Like, I'm upbeat, but it wasn't exactly what I wanted. I actually wanted something more like this. So it says, Toran's ability to communicate effectively is one of his strengths. He's kind, considerate, expressing his love and appreciation. Additionally, he is not afraid to show vulnerability. And then his overall style is friendly, respectful, and encouraging. Strong emphasis is on empathy and understanding, which this, I'm telling you, I didn't write this. I actually got this from the last version of the language model. So what this tells me in evaluation terms, again, is that although the evaluation wasn't a bad thing, it didn't say he was a horrible person. It just wasn't what I was looking for. So I was going to continue to steer the language model with our data. Next question I had was just a really simple question. Now, just for context, Christopher is my son. So if you're like, hey, who's this? But I figured, hey, there's got to be enough text messages. And it does say, hey, Toran, Christopher is my son. So it's in that funny format. You'll have to forgive it still. It doesn't know anything other than that. But it has a hallucination here, which says, he is the youngest of my 3 boys, which is just not true. I only have one son. I am proud of him, so I won't say this is all bad, but it's just kind of a funny text. Overall is not amazing, so we have some work to do. This was maybe the better text. This is what the final language model said, is that Toran is Christopher's father. They share a close bond. And then unfortunately, despite Toran's busy schedule with work, wow. And I don't even work on weekends. So like, I feel like this is kind of not doing me justice. But anyway, a little humor for the middle of the talk. All right. So now, this was not a great play, but this was only our first pass. It was 500 conversations. It wasn't me really looking at the data super carefully. And what I really this language that I'm going to use, I took it from this guy, Ronan McGovern, and he calls it incomplete statistical representation of the knowledge. There's a couple ways to look at this. You could say we didn't have enough data, which is probably half fair. I mean, we only had 500 conversations, but we could also say that a lot of the data that I had, both in my language and my style, and even about my son, maybe they only appeared one time or maybe two times. And in that one or two times that they appeared, they also probably appeared in the same sequence. So there's not a lot of diversity in the way the data is shaped. There's not a reversal of words or any kind of dynamic stuff. And if you looked into a lot of the mechanical early steps of the language model, it is truly like next token prediction. So it's sort of like following from left to right. And if you don't get a more diverse data set, you are kind of giving the language model what I liked, as he said, an incomplete representation. Now, I will give Ronan credit because you'll notice the little icon on the lower right again. Absolutely. In 2024, this is probably the greatest resource if you're trying to get into deep learning, any type of machine learning and fine tuning. Ronan is just a genius. I absolutely love the way he breaks stuff down. He does such a great job to simplify. If you're like me and you're not like a trained data scientist, you're just getting into it, I absolutely highly recommend all of his content. And it's basically all free content on YouTube. He does sell kind of like scripts for fine tuning and things like that, which is an interesting business model, but he's just such a great resource. I cannot recommend him highly enough. So check him out at some point as well. All right, so about this time, I was sort of fumbling through some really bad fine tunes. I'm not gonna lie, I spent probably over a month just doing really poor fine tunes and feeling really discouraged. And on the way to this synthetic world or this data generation, I stumbled upon this blog post from Helix, and it says how we got fine tuning Mistral 7B to not suck. And I was literally in this moment, right? My fine tunes were not good. Whoever this company was, I'd never heard of before, they had some sage wisdom. So I was like, I'm gonna check this out. And one of the things that they had trained, or they were trying to work out, was they were training a Q&A type model over data. So imagine you have a PDF, you chunk that PDF up and you ask it questions. They were just getting really bad results. And so their question was, so why isn't the model able to answer these questions about basic context? And they said, well, it's because the question answer pairs generated by the prompt aren't in the form of simple questions, which was one of their specific issues. And this is the part I want to key in on. They were saying the solution, it turns out, was rather than a single instruct output pair, like I had in my original work there, was to implement a suite of these, extracting context from the document in all sorts of different perspectives, which this is like the heart of the entire talk. Was like, this was such a light bulb moment for me. I thought this was actually too simple to be anything of value. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through my process doing this. I first want to talk about this bigger language model called Mixtral. Now, if you're new and you're like, wait, Mixtral, these are different. They're made by the same company. But the reason I want to highlight Mixtral with an X is that this Mixtral is a much bigger, more powerful model. And this matters a lot because what we need here is a more powerful model than the little 7 billion parameter that we're training to really produce high quality synthetic data. And we're doing this just because this is going to help us distill down a data set and then train the smaller model. Now, the reason I chose this, for those curious, is that I was still, again, not going to go to the cloud, not going to run this on another server. And I could run this Mixtral 8x7B on, if I quantized it, I could run it on my 4090. So again, I'm doing all this just at home, basically home lab. And this was a totally great and very quick model. Now, I did have to escape hatch out of Elixir a little bit. I borrowed from Llama CPP. So I took the Mixtral, that model from Hugging Face, pulled it down, and then quantized it or squished it down to the smallest version I could possibly do, because that allowed me to run that entire model in just 20 gigs of VRAM. So that was a huge issue, because obviously much bigger than that, you blow past your buffer of memory on that card. So there is a quick way. I wrote a blog post on this called Llama CPP and Elixir. Really, it's just using system.cmd. And a lot of you are pretty experienced Elixir people. It's just you almost shelling out to the command line. But I've had a lot of success doing this kind of basic thing. So Now, I want to take just a moment because what you're going to see for probably the next 5 minutes or so is a lot of prompts. And wow, this is a moment here. This is going to humble me. I think for a long time I was just really at odds with prompting. I was just like, prompting isn't real programming. I am against it. I don't like it. And that's just me. That's just my struggle. I hope it's not your struggle. I was very dogmatic, and I think it came from the early days when I was doing a lot of fine tuning last year. I just felt like the real programmers did fine tuning and the business people were doing prompting. And that's just not true. Prompting is just another tool. So I hope you don't have the baggage that I had. And I hope from these examples, you don't see prompting as a lesser than or some garbage or unvaluable thing. I think it's actually quite powerful. So let's take a look at the process. So first I want to talk about, I had the data, those conversations, but before I begin to prompt this big model, this mixtral model, and say write full conversations or text messages, I wanted to help it up, give it a leg up by saying first, summarize the text message conversation itself. And that would just allow us to provide both a summary and an example in our prompts. And again, those prompts are hopefully kind of the core driver. So after we have the summary, and here's just an example, it says Jason feels fortunate but trapped, acknowledges age affects workplace opportunities and expectations for higher value work. He's uncertain about the core team's future and trying to learn other ecosystems among the chaos. Toran is surprised by Jason's honesty. Oh man, I can't read this. Anyways, you kind of get the point. What's happening here is it summarizes what the conversation was about. Now, from that, both that summary and that original human written conversation that came from my actual text messages, I write a prompt like this: says, you are Toran, a human who is compassionate writer of original text messages. Write a text message from Toran to friend, whoever that is, and then use the text conversation below as an example to imitate his likeness. Now, this was just one. I'm going to have these like lighter colored things you can barely see on the bottom that kind of are the different styles of these prompts. This one I call the compassionate persona, but it was me trying to draw out compassion from my own work. And here's another one. This is one I've had a little bit better results with, which was write a short, encouraging message from Toran to friend using his conversational style. Focus on his thoughtful response, emphasizing encouragement. And this was another really good one. Here's an example of those two. An output might look like something like this: your honesty is refreshing, and I want you to know that it's more than okay to explore alternative career paths. Don't let age or others' expectations limit your potential. The idea of a lifestyle business or profitable non-unicorn startup isn't far-fetched at all. So not exactly perfect to my likeness, but there was actually quite a bit of similarity in some of this language. And so I continued to do this. I'm just going to show you, I can't show you every example, we just don't have time, but I do want to show you a couple more prompts, and I'll just show you the prompts and you'll have to use your imagination. So this one says, describe the most impactful takeaway from the conversation between Toran and friend. This one says, describe an opinion that is shared between Toran and friend as it relates, and then use the summary of the conversation. This one says, create a single nuanced question answer pair from the conversation. Some of these were not good, and I will show you examples later. This is, remember, this is a story, not a prescription for success. Here's another one that says, drawing on the rich history of conversation between Toran, craft a message that includes a personal anecdote relevant to the conversation. So just really funny things. And of course, these started to get a little more off the rails. Here's one that's like, describe the nature of the relationship. Which is an interesting one. And then this one is where it totally crashed and burned. Do not use this one, at least not in my case. It said write a short blog post. So let's take a look. We got this new data set with all of our synthetic data, and we're asking the exact same prompt. And this is the first output that we get back. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity for Ross to make a significant impact as a leader in the tech industry. Now, that does not sound like how I would, or anyone would open a text message to anyone. So this is not a good sign. All right, so I'm going to admit, because I got to be truthful, right? I basically took almost all of these blindly and then just dumped them in and fine-tuned them. And I was like, this will be fine. This is good, but the results were not. They were bad. So this is really where I spent a lot of time. And I'm just going to highlight this post, which I'm really just focusing on the title and then one blurb I'll share in a second focused here. But it says the it in AI models is the data set. Now, to be totally clear, I do not agree with everything that this author says in this post. But I think the part that is really important, and I'm sure you all know, is that the data itself that you train with just has a huge impact. And this was kind of their quote, their big takeaway. It was just, it's becoming awfully clear over many, many months of fine tuning in their work, that these models are truly an approximation of their data sets. So if you have a bunch of garbage in, you get a bunch of nonsense out, and that's all it is, right? So funny enough, I was extremely lazy because I didn't want to roll through this manually. And I wrote this prompt. I thought, well, let's take prompt engineering to the maximum. It says, determine if the prompt and output pair below will be helpful to train a generative language model on the task of writing text messages in the likeness of Toran about topics relevant to his life and relationships. It's almost crazy to read this now, but to be quite honest, this did really well. And by really well, I'm going to show you an example of one particular message that it just weeded out of many, but this one is just such a prime example of garbage. So I'm going to show you the instruction in this. It said, just for context here, Shalene is my wife. So it says, what are Toran and Shalene's plans for Christmas Eve, considering that no kids will be attending? The output is also just completely worthless. It says, Toran and Shalene plan to discuss and update each other on their Christmas Eve arrangements, but specific details about whether kids will be present or not have been mentioned. This is the most vague and worthless thing I've ever seen. So I'm totally glad that this little prompt I wrote ripped it out. But I will say I was not able to rip out everything, but I did do a little bit. I went back and remember that one prompt I told you about that I was really unhappy with. It was write a short blog post from the conversation. I basically found that almost every single one of those was a detractor. It was a bad idea to have ever written that prompt or used that data. So I ripped out every single blog post. And you can see here's an example where the output was just not my language at all. It's like, hello, young learners. I didn't even know. It was just a totally horrible prompt. Now, I wish I could say that this thing cut the data set in half and everything was fine, but I actually had to go a step further. Because after I ripped all those out and I did a fine tune and I started generating some responses and I was looking at them, there were some words that started popping up. And some of these words just really started to annoy me, is the only way to say it. For example, Happy Father's Day. Oh my gosh, that was showing up in like 3 out of 10 text messages when I wasn't asking for a Happy Father's Day. I don't know what was going on. It was everywhere. So here's an example of it, actually. I had a really short, and I apologize, this is a different prompt than we read, but it's me saying, write a text message to my friend Scott about machine learning and career growth. Now, the text message is just generally okay, but there's this really weird line at the end, which is what I was kind of alluding to, that all the messages from this fine tune and that data set were saying Happy Father's Day or like Merry Christmas, like weird stuff that was showing up a lot. So I went back, and this is probably the most code I'm showing in a slide, but I have a QR code because I'm just going to point backwards in time to my Orlando Elixir Conf talk. If you heard Michael at the top kind of introduced me, I gave a talk on fine tuning in particular at Elixir Conf, and this is really just that exact work. So don't have to worry about this code. It's just Axon code. And the part that's most interesting is when you do this type of classification work, you really just say, I want a couple classifications of text message. For example, in this case, I'm going to show the number 1 as a text message I did not like and that I wanted to be removed. And then number 2 was a text message that I thought was okay. It had some of my language. And then a text message with a classification of 3 was like, it's not good or bad, just leave it. And what this allowed me to do was obviously build just a really simple Roberta-based classifier that I could run all the rest of those text messages through and then just weed out, again, a huge chunk of really messy messages that we're not adding to the model. And then finally, this is just that code where I kind of run through the data set that I had cleaned previously with, both Happy Father's Day and all that nonsense. And this allowed me to whittle it down to just a much smaller and tighter JSON data set. So here's a version of this now. The prompt is the same, engineering management, but the bottom part here is the part that's interesting. And so it says, I'm thrilled to hear about the upcoming transition to engineering management. Your unique blend of expertise and emotional intelligence will undoubtedly make you an exceptional leader in this role. I won't read the rest of it, but while this was good, and these text messages were much higher quality, I also had occasionally, maybe 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10 of this new thing starting to show up that I hadn't seen before. And it was this Toran should express confidence, or additionally, Toran should, encourage, or it was kind of like commands that were kind of interesting because my text message prompt had not changed. It had said, write a text message, that's it. But because of these, I wanted to take one additional step, and we're going to talk about that step in just a minute. And at the simplest, you can think of it as alignment. Imagine in this case, you've got a pretty good model, right? It's spitting out, let's just say 70% of the messages and language that you want, but you want to steer away from a bad habit that's showing up in, let's say, 30%, like you see here. So we're going to do this, and I just called this alignment. I'll give it kind of the technical name here in just a minute. In the simplest, it's like this, right? I have my prompt, write a text message, and then I've got two answers. So we're going to create a data set. And the data set's going to have answer one that we're kind of happy about. That's our happy face. And number two is our scratching our chin, like, I don't know if I like this answer. And so we're going to denote or mark one of these answers as the right answer, clearly. And we're going to rename these now instead of answer 1 and 2. We're going to explicitly say that one of these is the chosen answer. One of these should be rejected. And this is called direct preference optimization. And if you don't need radical changes, this can actually be really effective. So here's an example. I just want to show the final end result of the JSON so that we're kind of clear on what I was doing. So first, I've just got these 3 keys. I've got rejected, chosen, and the prompt. And so it's important to know, obviously, rejected is like, this is what we do not want. Do not give me this. And that was a couple examples, like, additionally, Toran should provide guidance on how Rosh can leverage ... No, instead, I want the text message. I want your dedication to continuous improvement, your ability to connect with people, ... So that's kind of where we're aiming at. So this is the what, but the tricky part here is how. Like, you're telling me I have to generate another data set. Now, I did kind of half cheat here because I didn't tell you this earlier, but when I was first pulling a lot of my text messages with iMazing, I did not actually pick every single person I've text message. I kind of picked a handful of people that I was like, oh, I just want to see what these look like. Well, I'm thankful that I did that because now I went backwards in time and I was able to get text messages from other people that maybe I didn't have as many conversations. It was probably like 100 in total. It was very small, but I was able to take those as the real human written example. And this is important because what you're going to see is that we need a chosen or kind of the golden state. And that came from me, the human. But we are going to have, after we do that, we are going to take that golden version, the version that I wrote, and then we're going to ask a language model like Mixtral to write a prompt. And I'm just going to show you the end result. This is kind of the output of the write a prompt. It says, write a dialogue between Toran and Sam about their experience with LiveView, ... And the way we get this is, again, just some prompt engineering. So we're going to take the human version of that dialogue from me and Sam, let's say, and then we're going to prompt Mixtral again and say, hey, below is a conversation between Toran and Sam. Read that conversation carefully, then generate a 1-paragraph prompt, which was so odd. The first time, and I'll tell you who I give credit to a little bit later on this, but the first time this friend of mine told me about it, I was like, I don't know where we're going here. He said, just hang with me. You're going to have Mixtral, a powerful model, generate a prompt from an example that you're really happy with. I'm like, okay, I'm tracking. But I said, what about the rejected or the output from this prompt? Like, who will I feed this prompt to? And he said, okay, what if you prompt that less consistent, less capable fine tune, the one that you're not so happy with? And I thought, okay, so that's what I did. I took the fine tune that I had from earlier. I actually took kind of an earlier checkpoint, which just means it wasn't quite as polished, to be honest. I kind of backed up and took a less great version. And I used Llama CPP, again, this tool that just lets me take a fine tune and create this format that's called GGUF. And the only reason that I'm using GGUF is really for this third stage, is that after I created the GGUF, I actually quantize it. And this is really important again, and it's for speed. If I did not do this, this basically took 4 times as long to run. So, and actually a lot more memory as well. So let me just show you the final version. So I have this kind of crummy model, my own model, just so you know. And the Mixtral prompt, again, keep that in view at the top. The Mixtral prompt says, write a dialogue between Toran, but then we've got a new prompt that we're going to send along with that to the crummy Toran model that says, study this example carefully, use it as inspiration. Do not borrow from it verbatim, but try and keep the meaning. And then we're going to give this to the checkpoint model, the model that I had been working on that was not great. And then we're going to combine the human version, so the version I was happy with that I wrote in my text messages. We're going to then combine this crummy output, the one from this checkpoint model that we weren't thrilled. And then we're going to also include the Mixtral generated prompt. So that's synthetic as well. And again, you saw this earlier, but I just want to highlight, this is what comes out of it. We have a prompt generated by a bigger model. That's hopefully a good prompt. We have my chosen or my handwritten dialogue or text message. And then we have the one that's not great, and notably not great, because on purpose, we want to steer away from it. Now, I did write again because I used Python for this as well. I used a quick, really basic DPO script. You can find it all that same sloth library if you're interested. All it does is basically tune over the same data set with a chosen, rejected, and prompt. Very similar stuff. Now, I was able to get much more consistently. In fact, I don't think with this version of the model, the final version, I got any of the weird like preamble that was like, hey, Toran should give Ross a pat on the back or any of that weird stuff that was kind of at the beginning. Instead, it was like this, hey, dude, I'm so excited to hear that you're considering a move into engineering management this year. Your passion for people and technical excellence will make you an ideal fit, ... So long story short, I was really happy with that. Now, all credit, again, this is not some crazy idea. If any of you know John Durbin, or if you've heard of John Durbin, he's, in my opinion, he's like the software engineer turned, AI engineer, data scientist, whatever you want to call it. He's one of the most prolific fine-tune and data set curators and creators that's out there that I know of in Hugging Face. And he just full out laid this out for me. And just, John, if you ever watch this, which I'm sure you won't, just huge thanks. This was just a really cool way to expand my thinking. I just really got a lot from that example. So, all right, so data science. Again, I'm not a data scientist, and I probably don't spend enough time in the data science world. I probably should do a better job of that. But I definitely did want to focus on a few things, because part of this, and I don't know how many hours, I should have logged just how many hours, but you're going to spend a lot of time if you go through this process, looking at data, analyzing it, cleaning it, merging it. And I highly recommend that you set up some way to kind of track your evaluation and your loss. Here I'm using weights and biases, which is basically a free tool. If you just want to use it for personal use, you can sign up for Teams. But generally, it allows you to see when your eval loss begins to spike. Now, if you're not super excited or don't know what that means, generally this is a sign in the data science community where, oh, the model is beginning to become better at memorizing the training set than it is generalizing. And kind of the goal of the tuning is to not, memorize one set of data. It's actually to just generalize, like you saw in my kind of final example. So I would recommend this. And one thing I actually did is, if you don't feel like you ever see the spike like you see in the purple color, then you probably have not fine-tuned long enough or hard enough. So I would recommend trying to find where the rubber comes off the tracks. And in this case, you can see it was kind of after about 20, or just before 2.5 thousand records of fine-tuning. And so I kind of went to a 3,000 or a 3 epic fine-tune and just basically took a checkpoint earlier and said, let's try a couple of these and kind of see, is it right before that spike or right after that spike that was a problem? And I was able to kind of qualitatively see a difference in those models. Now, with that said, and data is great. I enjoy data. I would highly recommend, and that's why you see the little icon in the lower right here, is this scientist, Dr. Nathan Lambert, spoke on latent space. He actually had an interesting quote where he said, I didn't know to read the language model outputs and kind of understand this qualitative sense of the models. And he says later, if you were early to see how different the language that was written by these models was, I think you'd have been early to find things like ChatGPT and RLHF. And really what this means, and what it does for me, because I've really been less of a data person, I'm just less of a data scientist. I was chatting with my models all the time. Every time I fine-tuned, I didn't just run an eval and run a bench and say it's good or it's bad. I threw that thing up in NX and I chatted with it. And so I would definitely encourage you, like data and especially eval and training loss are helpful, but definitely as well train the model and chat with it. And I think this is just a really good podcast that kind of talks about it. Now, I did promise to throw a little bit of serving. So I have a full chat app, the one that you saw me playing with here, that is a true NX Elixir app. It's just called Mistral Chat F16. And the code is all up online here, nothing super exciting. What I want to show is that throughout this process, I not only took a fine tune with Unsloth, but what's so cool about Unsloth is like it actually does a really smart upcast of the weights in that model to F16. And that allows you to basically dump a directory like you see here, which was Toran B sloth model. And you can literally just point NX at this with the Hugging Face library and all the tools in Bumblebee, and this thing will spin up and you can use it. There's no like Python to Axon or any magic that you have to do. You can literally just dump your directory, upscale it to 16, merge the weights, and then use it. It was super cool. Now I'm going to cover a few things that you probably want to do, or at least I did. One of those is to use this new type parameter in the latest Bumblebee and to basically shrink it from the full 32 to FB16, which just allows you to use less memory. And in this case, It just made the model seem like it booted up a little bit faster. So I don't know if that's just my sense, my gut feel, but F16. And then a few other parameters that you want to consider, and this just is both part of your testing, the qualitative testing, as well as your final production run. There are a few parameters on the configuration here. Temperature is kind of the one that gives you the most variability in your output. A lot of people will say the higher this number that goes, the more chaotic or the more unpredictable your output is. Now at 0.8 or 0.9, I was getting pretty good results. Once I got to even 1.0 or 1.1, I wasn't getting exceptionally great results. So I would say somewhere between 0.7 and 1.0 is probably a good temperature. The other two things that you may not know, but definitely come up in the channels in Slack if you're ever in talking to someone about NX or Bumblebee, is to include a strategy for multinomial sampling. And both top P and top K, which the way I think of these are, we're trying to limit to some extent, we're trying to limit to the best possible tokens, and top P and top K are slightly different in that way. And truly, I don't know the depth of how those are different, but I definitely found if I started to ratchet up the top K to like 49, 59, 69, the output was both a little more broken, like it wasn't complete sentences all the time, and it was a lot more repetitive. So I think as you begin to tweak your top P and K upward, you also begin to kind of shrink the pool of the number of tokens you use. So just watch those. This was a really great number for me. I found top P was anywhere between 0.7 and 0.9, and then top K was around 40, which I kind of stole that from the Llama CPP defaults. I think they use top K 40 there. So. And then finally, if you're running this and you want really quick inference, I definitely recommend adding compile to your generation. Just add sequence links of whatever you're using, like 1024, 2048, 4096, whatever length that you actually are prompting with, throw those in here and you'll just basically get instant responses. Like if I didn't do this and originally I did not have a compile step in here, then it would take, possibly 7 to 10 seconds. And I was like, why is this so slow? So definitely include a sequence length with your compile options here. All right, I know we're probably way over in time, and I want to share just a few things that I would have done differently if I was continuing on this personal project, and I'll keep them as brief as I can. One is just simply less is more, right? When I was originally doing this, I was trying to build like a 20-some thousand data set, and I was going to do it at all costs, right? It didn't matter what the data looked like, but of course we learned through this process that if we could do it all over again, it'd be better, higher quality data. And you see this in newer models like 5.3 from Microsoft. They actually had a quote about prioritizing data quality. And when they did that, they were able to catch up to some of these other models that were just prioritizing quantity. So I think quality plays just an absolutely huge role. I think a lot of us know that. There's also an idea that I would love to, I may actually do this if I can get some spare time in the next month or so, which is actually take what I've learned here, take the data set and distill down an even better, cleaner data set and take a run at a smaller model. So not necessarily just the Mistral 7B, but actually something like Phi 3B. And here's the Phi 3B Mini 4K Instruct as an example. And I just think this would be pretty cool because we don't often think when we're kind of hacking in the demo, playing around mode about the operational cost and complexity and even the inference speed, the actual time to turn this stuff around. And I think that some of the cool stuff as you shrink these models down is, I mean, here's and highlighted in bold at the bottom is that once you get these smaller and smaller, imagine you could get the power of an 8x7B, but on your smartphone, your iPhone, how powerful that would be, and just really what type of form factor unlock would do for innovation, which is kind of cool. Now, I learned a ton and I hopefully shared something that was of value, but I really think of the current state of software. We're innovating really in these three axes. We have data, we have the models, and we have just last mile UX, or how do we use this? And I definitely feel like some of the data, which is what I spent a lot of time on today, is a huge and known powerful asset. But I don't necessarily know if I have thought through all the ways that this data and what I've shown here today can differentiate to make our products better, truly better for the end user. So my challenge to everybody at the end here is just build, measure, and learn to do some true innovation. And that really comes through this process from the lean startup. So thank you guys.
Thank you. That was really fantastic.